Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to BEC's webinar, Is Hong Kong Ready to Ride on China's Carbon Neutral Pledge? My name is Simon Ng, BEC's Director of Policy and Research, and I'm your host today. First of all, I would like to say good morning and also good evening for those who join us from different time zones. I hope you enjoy our event today. And also, I would like to extend my gratitude to the Institute for the Environment of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology as our supporting organization. On September the 22nd, 2020, President Xi Jinping made a pledge that China would achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. China's commitment to an absolute carbon reduction target has brought a lot of positivity in the international community. I think we are very keen to find out how China is going to become carbon neutral in 40 years and try to learn as much as we can from China's experience. Especially in Hong Kong, we are also eager to understand how China's ambition means for Hong Kong. So today we are very pleased to put together a panel of distinguished speakers, experts and business leaders. And we are going to have a conversation on this important issue. But before we start, I would like to first introduce our key speakers, Professor Christine Lo. I think Christine doesn't need any introduction. She's now the Chief Strategist at the Institute for the Environment of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and she's spending a lot of time in Hong Kong as well as in the US, still focusing on different environmental issues, in particular on climate change issues. So without further ado, I would like to invite Christine to share her thoughts on China's pledge and ambitious target. Christine, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to go through a little bit about background before I go into China's pledge and what it means. The first point I want to talk about relates to a bit of the background, then about the new agenda and why I think it's a new agenda, not just any old policy, but really something that will drive China's development forward. And then approximately how China needs to get there. And actually, it's also a way for other countries to think about if they were to do the same thing, gives us a sense of what are the things that countries need to do. And then finally, we'll have a look at what choices Hong Kong have. Now, for background, I just want to go back to this very, very famous statement by the previous premier, Wen Jiabao, in 2007. It was a very high-profile comment. He basically said the way that China was developing was unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. So after that, what was China going to do about it? Going down a bit of memory lane, you can see from these pictures that from 2007 up until, you could say, 2012, 2013, the environmental situation in China was pretty bad. And I think these pictures tell a story. And certainly most people remember, if they remember nothing else about China's environmental problems, the very severe air pollution in the Beijing area and in many other parts of China. Well, in 2013, actually, China came up with the first plan to fight air quality. That doesn't mean they didn't do anything before 2013, but in 2013, they really kickstarted a national plan. In 2014, during the National People's Congress, the subsequent premier also announced that China was going to have a war. I mean, he actually used this phrase, we're going to have a war against pollution. Well, actually, from that time, you could track all the things that China was actually doing. In already 2012, the Chinese Communist Party actually changed the party constitution to add a phrase, ecological progress, as a mandate for the party and party officials. By 2015, Hong Kong certainly took note that the People's Bank of China, which is China's central bank, they published together with the UNEP, which is the United Nations agency that looks after environmental issues, they published a plan on how China was going to establish a green financial system. I recommend that if you are in the financial sector and you haven't read this plan, that you do go and read it, because you will see that since it was published in April 2015, China is following that path. Now, later on in that year, I think everybody remembers there was the Paris Agreement, where China and the United States play pivotal role to bring countries together to be able to agree on the Paris Agreement. In 2016, because China was hosting the G20 in Hangzhou, and at that time, America and China were partnering on climate change, they also made a point there of launching more initiatives relating to green finance. Now, I'm not going to talk about this. I just want to show you the 14 recommendations in that Chinese plan about greening the Chinese domestic financial system. And it's a very ambitious, very big plan. Whoops, excuse me, let me go backwards. I want to now come to the present, which is China's pledge for carbon neutrality by 2060. The point I want to make is this didn't come out of the blue. Now, I want to make a few points about what President Xi Jinping said. So it was the first time that China actually talked about a specific date and a specific reduction target. So that's very important. And you will all remember, because China, up until very recently, had talked about the developed economies had a larger responsibility to deal with climate change because they were the first to industrialize. China is no longer focusing on that. China is really giving a signal that carbon neutrality, it's its new development path. The development's going to cover technology, industry, and pretty much everything, including the lives of ordinary citizens. Now, in the red box there, I think it's very important for us to note this. Whilst China has accepted the responsibility, it is also saying, because it recognizes that only when China's emissions peak will global emissions peak. I also want to say that there was another date where Xi Jinping said something very important. He also said it at a high-profile event in the United Nations, and it was just a few days after the carbon neutrality pledge on the 30th of September. He really talked about the importance of protecting nature and biodiversity. The point I wanted to highlight this is you're going to see a two-track approach in China, carbon neutrality as well as spending a lot more effort on biodiversity. With the 14th five-year plan coming, I think everybody understandably is expecting China will have more to say about its path towards carbon neutrality. But there are two other occasions in 2012 that we should note. The first one is going to be in May, and that is the COP meeting for biodiversity, and that is being held in Kunming. This was delayed from this year, and that meeting would have been held about now if it wasn't for COVID. So the delay means some of the things that the world will bring on the table, including China's further pledges on biodiversity, we will hear about it in the coming months. Then, of course, COP26 for climate change is going to be in Scotland later in the year, and we can also expect China to have more to say. Now, I just want to bring everybody back to what China has promised so far. This is a picture of the previous president of China, President Hu Jintao, in 2009 when he was at the UN summit. There, he pledged China to cut carbon intensity. He he promised that China would increase forest stock, and he also tied it to a non-fossil fuel amount by 2020. Now, on the right-hand side, you will see that China has essentially already achieved those targets. This is a map I would like you to just hold for a second to look at, because this is the pathway and this is the Chinese policy and political narrative going forward. This year, by 2020, China will have achieved its target to reduce the worst poverty. And this is something China is very proud of. And also, during the 13th five-year plan, and we're coming to the end, the tail end of the 13th five-year plan, but let us not forget important aspect of the current plan. In the plan, there are control measures for the volume and intensity of China's total energy consumption. And we will hear from China soon in terms of the accountability that what goals have been reached. So coming into the 14th five-year plan, I think people are waiting to see whether China will announce some kind of a coal cap. Is it going to come in the 14th five-year plan, or could it come in the 15th five-year plan? I also highlighted in one box here that China had already announced that it intends to reach the energy efficiency of Japan by the time of the end of the 15th five-year plan. So in 2030, China has already plans in place to catch up on energy saving. It has also already made a pledge that by then, the coal share of energy will be reduced to 42.6%. So I just want to say that in the next 10 years, there are already markers of what China said it's going to do. Now, going forward between 2035 and 2050, obviously that's further down the road. No doubt China will come up with many other plans, which we'll look at in a minute. And by 2060, the vision of development is carbon neutrality. Now, we're not going to go into the details of this very complex chart, but the four important pathways to China achieving carbon neutrality is to electrify everything, is to decarbonize electricity, is to greatly increase energy efficiency, and to get on the pathway for circular economy. A few days actually after President Xi's pledge at the UN, Tsinghua University actually has a climate change institute. It came up with important statements for all of us to think about. I mean, and the reason I said earlier on that this pledge didn't come out of the blue is because we know in China, experts have in fact been working on the idea of what it takes for China to achieve carbon neutrality actually for quite a long time. So you see here some of the things that people within this group have already been saying. So we've already talked about when China might cap coal. Well, for sure, China is going to tighten its commitment for 2030 under the Paris Agreement. The transition fuel is going to be natural gas, and the end of the use of coal for electricity, Tsinghua is saying it could be achieved at around 2050. There will be a huge ramp up of renewable energy and nuclear, and that by 2060, the use of electricity will be 80%. Now, just something for everybody to think about. To electrify everything, what are the elements that any country, certainly China, will have to deal with? Well, first of all, there are many social political considerations. So just imagine you are Shanxi province, Henan province, where your economy, a large part of it is related to coal. How will a country deal with this? How will China deal with the social dimensions and the economic vitality of those coal-based provinces? Also dealing with the different types of energy, coal, gas, solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, hydrogen, all these different types of energy, all being, all being reduced or ramped up at the same time. And they have very different characteristics. So you need fantastic engineering and good management to be able to actually deal with this transition. Now, then you have questions about, well, how fast are we able to go? How far can we go during that time? We know we have to electrify transportation. How are we actually going to do that? What might be some of the new technology that are coming up? And how can we manage to save energy a lot more? Carbon trading, what part will it really play in the longer run? And are we going to see carbon capture or carbon use? Now, I want to share this very interesting graph with you. You can see the source, where it comes from. So the question people ask is China really going to be able to replace its coal-fired power by 2050, 2060? Well, what China really has to do is to close down a lot of these plants. And people have asked, but actually at this moment, China is still building new plants and it has plants on the table. So the logic a lot of people are saying is, surely you've got to stop all of that. Now, my understanding of what China is likely to do is that it will close down coal plants, but at the same time, it's not yet going to stop building newer plants. The reason is, if we assume that coal plants will have a 30-year life, you can kind of see here that between 2030 and 2060, how it's going to start closing down massive numbers of older coal plants, but the remaining coal plants will be the new coal plants, which means I think what China is going to do is it wants that by the time you get to mid-century, the coal plants it still has will be the cleanest in the world. And let us not forget what China has done. Because it believes that certain countries in the world, like China, like India, like Indonesia and others, they have coal. They don't necessarily have other energy sources. So it's very difficult to ask such countries to not deal with its coal. But if you are going to exploit coal, then one thing you can do is be as clean as possible. And that's why over the course of the last 10 plus years, China has continued to develop super ultra critical toll technology. Now, how much is it all going to cost? I mean, this is a phenomenal number that you're seeing here. Tsinghua University, at the same time, talking about what the transition is going to have to look like, also threw out a number, 174 trillion RMB. That's about 26 trillion US dollars. And you can see from here that it says out of the 174 trillion, 138 trillion will have to be spent between 2020 and 2050 in the energy and electricity systems alone. So we're talking about huge numbers. And from 2030 onwards, Chinese experts are saying the average CO2 reduction rate will go down 8 to 10% a year. So this is tremendously ambitious. Okay, finally, let's come and talk about Hong Kong. My view is for Hong Kong, it is for Hong Kong to choose whether going forward, what is our galvanizing focus? You know, society needs something to bring people together. Decarbonization is going to be one of those big focus that China will push out. In fact, it's lost no time in pushing this out, because if you go and talk to local officials, whether in the GBA or elsewhere in China, they've all taken note about what they have to do with the environment, including on carbon reduction. So do we look at Hong Kong as just ourselves, or do we plug into the big picture in China? Also, I think China is going to pass some kind of a regulatory law, which gives China a kind of legal framework to decarbonize. Question, will Hong Kong also need to think about passing some kind of law? Now, China won't be the first country in the world to do this, because the UK has already passed a climate law. So what will China's climate law look like? And what might a Hong Kong and Macau climate framework look like? Now, then again, I think for Hong Kong and for Macau, how fast do we want to go? And at what kind of quality? These things are for us to choose. Many of you from Hong Kong, you will remember these plans. These are the plans that the previous government put out, and these are the plans that are operating in Hong Kong today. The air quality and the climate plans are particularly important in terms of, obviously, decarbonization and energy saving. The Secretary for Environment has told us that he intends to publish 4 important policy documents next year in 2021. There will be one on popularizing electric vehicles. There'll be a clean air plan. And there will be a new climate plan that points towards 2050. And I think it'll be very difficult for Hong Kong not to go for carbon neutrality by 2050, because the tradition in Hong Kong over the course of the last 15 years has always been, as a developed part of China, we look at something that is a little ahead of the game. So if the whole country is going to go for 2060, I think there is good reason for Hong Kong to see if we can do it by 2050. And there's also a new tech plan that will be coming out. So to summarize, my first point is China is spending a lot of time and resources on science and research. China believes in science, it believes in research. So I think for Hong Kong, there's a lot of collaborative opportunities with research partners on the mainland. This is something that I think the government can fund and do, and this is also something that the private sector can do. One of the things that any economy, including the one in China, needs to do to decarbonize at a very fast pace is you really need to be very confident about your data. You need to know what's happening in your economy. So I think the Chinese experts, they've actually developed a system of collecting all kinds of data in China. They are using big data and AI, and part of that push for decarbonization is also one for all kinds of data science going forward. The second thing is, of course, about having a plan in Hong Kong for electrification. This will provide all kinds of new business opportunities and models. And this, I think, is something that is possible only by government and the private sector, together with the economy, the community getting together to discuss what this transition is going to look like. Thirdly, we've got to make saving energy a really, really big deal. And you've got to reward people for doing that. So obviously, our buildings have to be the most energy efficient, our infrastructure as well, and also appliances. And let us not forget, appliances are being imported from all over the world to Hong Kong. And it's up to us to set aggressive standards. Fourthly is transport and our urban design and our urban planning. We've got to have more charging infrastructure if we're really going to electrify transport. And how are we going to deal with buses and minivans? Because these today are a very important part of our public transport structure and also our ferries. Government has some kind of a plan to electrify ferries, but we really need to get on with thinking about how to deal with buses and minibuses. And lastly, well, these things all cost money. So Hong Kong as a finance center, we got to think about how to fund our own transition, but Hong Kong is here to fund China's and Asia's transition to decarbonization as well. So obviously here we need policy framework, we need the universities, we need the we also need the professionals in Hong Kong to really step up on talent training in order for Hong Kong to actually play that role of serving not only ourselves, but the mainland and the region. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for your presentation and your insights. And I think a lot of food for thoughts, and certainly we'll come back to you later on some of the points, especially towards the end. It seems like, you actually ask us a few questions and it's a bit open-ended, and certainly hold your thoughts and we'll get back to that later. And right now I would like to, invite other panelists to join us in the conversation, because as I said earlier on today, we have a very distinguished panel, not only from Hong Kong, but also from outside Hong Kong. So I'd like to first introduce, sitting next to Christine, to her left is Mr. Richard Lancaster, CEO of CLP Holdings Limited. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Simon.
And sitting next to Richard, to his left, is Mr. Jonathan Drew, Managing Director, ESG Solutions, Global Banking of HSBC. Hi, Jonathan.
Thank you, Simon.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you. And joining us live from Tokyo, we have Mr. Justin Wu, Head of Asia Pacific, Bloomberg NEF. Justin, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Hi, Simon. Hi, everyone.
You need to unmute your mic, Justin.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Can you try again?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Okay. We couldn't hear you at the moment. We will work out. But let's move on to our next speaker. Helen Clarkson, CEO of the Climate Group, joining us from London. Helen, good morning.
Good morning. Hi. Great to be able to join you.
Can just make sure that you have unmuted your mic.
I'm unmuted.
I can hear you too, Helen. I think it's on their side actually. They can't hear us.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have some technical issues here. Helen, can you hear me? But we can't hear you right now. And Justin, you can hear me? Okay, now let me work out, let us work out the sound issue. But if that's the case, let me, turn to our local speakers first. Richard, if I may start with you. I think CLP's decarbonization journey actually started more than 15 years ago, if I remember correctly. And very recently, you've been, working on your climate vision 2050. I think probably a year ago, that's an update. Now, I remember at that time, we were, quietly thinking, okay, can we have clearer policy directions, either from the Hong Kong government or even better from Beijing? Now that we've heard from Beijing, and it's a very clear pathway, what they want to achieve by 2060, what would you say in terms of the impact on CLP's moving forward? So that's my first question. But related, for the power sector in general, do you see opportunities for the local market as well as for regional collaboration, working closer with mainland China, because they have to decarbonize, and maybe they are learners, and maybe there are, opportunities to collaborate with them.
Thank you, Simon. You're absolutely right that CLP has been on a decarbonisation journey. Actually, we could go back a lot further in our history to the 1970s when we first built a transmission line to connect Hong Kong and Guangdong province. Another major milestone was investing in the Diabei nuclear power station, which gave Hong Kong access to zero carbon energy. More recently, CLP has been an investor in wind farms, solar farms, and hydroelectric plants right through mainland China and indeed through the Asian region. So we have a very long, rich experience there. Well, one thing I would say about the impact of President Xi Jinping's announcement is that any policy clarity for the business sector is absolutely welcome. So to understand the direction of travel, to see clear targets, that is absolutely important to give confidence to the business sector to invest. One of the things that Christine brought out in her presentation is that when China sets targets, they deliver them. And when you look at the targets that are set for the electricity industry through all of China's 5-year plans, every time there is a target set for the electricity generation sector, it is met. So we have a high degree of confidence in not only China's ability to meet targets, but the consistency of their policy. So these targets that China has announced, and it's more than just the headline of the decarbonisation by 2060 and the peaking by 2030, but when you get down to a more granular level of detail there and understand how those targets will be met and the way this will unfold, it does provide a great deal of clarity. Now, what does this mean for the power sector? Well, if you consider that in order for an economy as large and diverse as China to decarbonize, that it will require massive electrification, massive decarbonization of its electricity sector. For an electricity company, that can only represent an enormous opportunity, but way beyond our scale that we operate in. I think that's one thing that we have to understand about China, is that these changes are on a massive scale, an unprecedented scale, but it's one thing that China does extremely well, is deal at scale. And if you look at China's current level of electricity consumption, it's around 6,000 gigawatt hours a year. If you look at projections for 2050, for that, for the level of electricity consumption in
a net zero carbon economy, that would be around 15,000 gigawatt hours. So 2.5 times current levels. When you're building solar panels and wind farms, they don't generate 24 hours around the clock in the way that fossil fuel plants do. So when you add a gigawatt of capacity from renewable energy, it has to be 4 times what it would be. So replacing a gigawatt of coal power with renewable energy, you need about 4 times that gigawatt. So the capacity that will have to be built is about 4 times China's current generation capacity. Now, China already is producing electricity on a massive scale. So these are mind-boggling numbers. And one of the things that will be needed is a massive acceleration in the pace at which this new generating capacity will be brought on. Again, if I refer to some of the numbers in Christine's presentation, for China to go from almost 0% of renewable energy to 15% of its energy mix, saw it building renewable capacity at a pace faster that way outstripped anybody else in the world. They did that in a way that was done through very clear but very direct subsidies. If you wanted to build a renewable energy project, you would get not only the grid price for your electricity, but you could also collect a subsidy which closed the gap and made your project economic. Now, CLP participated in these schemes from 2007 up to now. What China is seeing is for the way ahead, continuing to supply subsidies is not something which is sustainable. It produces a burden on the societal wealth, but it's also an inefficient way to build at that scale. We have seen advances in technology and considerable reduction in the cost of renewable energy. And so going forward, China will be needing to find a way to regulate the development of renewable energy. And it does require regulation, it requires coordination and planning, but to do that in a way without the subsidies that have been the mechanism that they've used in the past. We have seen a little bit of a pause in the development of renewable energy over the last couple of years while these new regulatory mechanisms are developed and become mature. But once they are, I have great confidence that the pace will pick up and that we will see huge opportunities for investment.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Justin, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Simon. Can
excellent,
you hear me?
Excellent. So welcome, Justin. Good to have you. Now, since Richard's been talking about renewable energy sector and the development in China, he talks about regulation. We need regulation to be ready. We have to think about subsidy and how we're going to deal with that in the long run. Since you focus a lot, not just on China, but also in Southeast Asia, in Asia Pacific, can you share your thoughts on renewable energy developments now, given the context that China, as well as Japan and South Korea, has recently announced their carbon neutrality plan? And, is it going to be a driver for, accelerated development on renewable energy? And what's your thoughts in terms of the enabling factors that's required to make it happen and make it happen quicker?
Sure. Thanks, Simon, for the question. And I definitely agree with much of sort of Richard's remarks just a moment ago. I mean, obviously, this represents a massive opportunity for renewable energy. I think just to take a step back, and also going back to Christine's presentation, I think we have to remember that net zero does, when a country makes a net zero carbon pledge, it really means two things. I think one is that we're talking about all the sectors of the economy which generate carbon emissions. In the case of China, that's about half of that is coming from power generation and heat. About another quarter or so comes from industry, and then another 10 or 15% comes from transport, and then other areas. So when we talk about a net zero carbon pledge, it covers everything. There's no margin of error in some cases. We have to sort of go all the way with all those areas. And the second thing, of course, is, and to Richard's point as well, is the scale. The scale is absolutely enormous. I think in some ways, when we took a look at possible pathways, there are technological solutions right now with renewable energy, with energy storage, with hydrogen. But one thing we have to remember is that in order to achieve net zero, we need to build renewable energy at a scale that's unprecedented at the moment. It has to happen on a much bigger scale. And then if we were to use, let's say, hydrogen to decarbonize industrial processes or heavy transport, the so-called hard to abate sectors, which you can't easily just use electricity to do. You also need zero carbon electricity to produce the hydrogen, which is also an significant order of magnitude required. So it is a massive opportunity in some ways if you're looking at power generation or to build, but the scale is enormous. And I think this raises a number of questions, which you raised, Simon, is that, I think many of us on this panel and also listening to this webinar probably know a lot about or know something about renewable energy and the fact it's becoming more cost competitive, it's scaling, and despite what we said about COVID-19, renewable energy has continued to do relatively well this year. We're still above $300 billion of investment in clean energy a year globally, and you know, more than half of that is in the Asia Pacific region. But we want to sort of achieve a net zero goal for a country as large as China. We need to see magnitudes of that far larger than what we've seen so far. And I think it's not going to be a simple question of whether you know, a single policy can do it, right? It will probably require scaling and sort of multi-year commitment and an effort that we haven't really seen before. It's not to say that it's sort of, well, it is to say it's going to be very challenging, but I think it is setting that target obviously means that it has somewhere to go. And I think that's very sort of significant for the Chinese government to set a target like that.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Now, before I ask my next question, I would like to remind the participants, you are welcome to ask our panelists and speakers questions. So if you have a question to ask, please use the Q&A chat box, type your question in, and then we will, you know, ask the questions and direct the questions to the panelists that you identified. Okay? So now I'd like to turn to Helen. Helen, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Excellent. Yes. You have your coffee?
Great. Not yet, actually. So I was just thinking that I should have done that.
Okay, maybe you can have one after this. Now, Helen, Justin just talked about, you know, the impact of this announcement. Now, if I recall correctly, at the time when President Xi made the announcement, I think you were busy with the Climate Week in New York City. So can you tell us what was the reaction, you know, with the international community? Especially, I think this is something, even though Christine mentioned that it's not something from the blue, actually that's been brewing for a while, but the announcement itself comes as a surprise to many of us. So what's your thoughts, and how would that affect climate action globally in the years to come?
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. It was a great moment. It was, as you say, during Climate Week New York, which we were holding mostly online this year. But we always hold that alongside the UN General Assembly. And the two go very well together. Normally you have all the UN leaders, you know, in New York, and then we have Climate Week alongside, and we often invite them to come and speak, and you can get these leaders to think about climate change. So in a year where it was virtual, it was actually great to get a big climate announcement and start to talk about that. And the reaction from the international community was really, seems incredibly significant. Of course, because at that point, there was a president in the White House in the US who was on the verge of pulling the US out of Paris. And one of the things that was so successful about getting the Paris Agreement in 2015 was China and the US coming together and making this commitment and pushing that to the rest of the world. And so what we saw in September was this amazing announcement from China, which sort of put a mark in the sand that said, we're not going to wait for the US again. We're going to do this. This is the way the world's going. And I think that's what gave everyone a sort of positive lift of, look, we don't have to have the US here. It would be great, but you know, the world is carrying on. And I think we've seen that then supported through other commitments, as we've talked about already this morning, Japan, South Korea, and others. Of course, now there's a president-elect who says that one of his first priorities is getting the US back into the Paris Agreement. There's a lot of work to do. You know, what we're saying this morning is, I think, both things. Great to see these commitments, lots of work to do. From the US point of view, that they need to make a new NDC, a nationally determined commitment, in order to get back in. The US commitment before was rated as critically inadequate. So there's a lot to do to close the gap. But I think you'll see, I think, a new positive move forward for the climate, because you're going to see the US has got to do a lot of work very quickly to get to Glasgow next year. And you're going to see China starting to come forward with its plans. And I think the moments that Christine mentioned are really important, because as an international community, we look at those moments as when we can sort of keep the pressure on, keep the eyes on, you know, what's the momentum, not just wait once a year for the UN talks, but look throughout the year at how these things all fit together. So, you know, if we want to get to net zero globally, we want to get to hold warming at 1.5, we've got to have all countries, whatever the size, and the more we can see regions working together and collaborating, I think we'll get there.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I will get back to you later on COP, because I think I'd like to get a preview from you about COP next year and what we can expect from COP. But right now, I'd like to turn to Jonathan. Jonathan, we talk a lot about China's ambition. We talk about scale, and we need resources to make things happen. Now, I understand that HSBC, you also make recent announcement about your plan in terms of carbon emission from your portfolio, your customers, and also, of course, your other role as a bank is to support businesses, for example, to make things happen. So what's your plan in terms of gearing up your services to support this ambitious plan from China, and potentially also later on in Hong Kong?
Simon, well, thank you very much for the question, and thank you to you and the BEC for inviting me to be here today. Before answering your question, I just wanted to say how pleased I was to hear Helen challenging the US already. It's not just a matter of walking back into Paris. There's work to be done, and I think that's a very important point. In terms of HSBC, and I don't want to talk too much about a single institution, but yes, on the early October, we did set out publicly our ambition to become a net zero bank. There were sort of three components to what we were really saying. Firstly, the net zero piece, and what does that mean? Obviously, we all know net zero comes from science. I don't think I need to go into why it's net zero. A couple of things, though, that I think are relevant is just to sort of understand and think about the different components that go into net zero, and how different activities conducted in different parts of the world may transition at a different speed. So we, for example, said, well, our operations, because we are fundamentally we are a financial services company, so we ought to be able to get our operations to zero pretty quickly. We set 2030. It would be quicker than that, or rather, I should say, the speed to which we can get there will depend in a large part on how Richard and other colleagues can help us here in Hong Kong. But then to your point around our portfolio, and of course, financed emissions, where financial institutions probably have their biggest influence, yes, to align that portfolio to a transition to net zero by 2050. So we are following what we might call the sort of stylized pathway that was set out in sort of the global average, as it were, by the IPCC for a transition that will keep us with, I think, a 66% probability of staying below 2 degrees centigrade. So that's clearly the ambition that we've set out. Then we've started to talk about how we're going to support our clients in that process, because clearly capital is required, and what a financial institution has is capital to support that transition. And that really means doing two things. And we used words in our announcement like applying a climate lens to our financing decisions. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think there are two things. The first is that when we look at our clients, we're not saying a client who is high carbon is a client to whom we are not going to be providing capital support. We're going to be focused on their transition plan and the robustness of that plan. So that's thinking about what we will support. But obviously on the flip side, the things that we are suggesting and we're saying that we won't be supporting is where clients don't have a valid transition plan. Now, there's a lot of detail to go into what exactly does that mean, and I'll perhaps come back to that very, very, very briefly at the end. But then in terms of sort of the other part of the ambition statement was to talk about some specific initiatives that we have already started to undertake to actually facilitate that transition, and they relate to creating a pool of resources to invest in natural capital, the creation of natural capital to invest in the creation of natural carbon sinks, because I think they have a very significant role to play, as well as the the emissions mitigation technologies. We're talking also about funds that we are creating for clean tech ventures. And we also talk, I think very importantly, about the need to develop and promote low carbon infrastructure as an asset class so that we can mobilize more capital into that space. Now, of course, coming back to this sort of question around, we're not the only bank to have said that. There are a number of banks who've said that. And of course, as we've talked about already, there are a number of sovereigns who've made those statements. I think there are now more than 70 plus sovereigns who've come out with commitments to net zero at different stages of making their way into legislation and so forth. But of course, what we have to avoid is that this just isn't a sort of a mass waving of pieces of paper that say sort of net zero in our time. We actually have to turn those into actions to drive decarbonisation by very much supporting the types of investment that sort of Richard's talked about in his business, and Justin has of course talked about more broadly in the energy space. But of course, it's across. It's these investments are going to be required on both in thinking of the sort of the energy balance, both on the supply side, but also the demand side as well. So driving efficiency into all sectors of economic activity.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Now, if I may, I would like to take the first batch of questions from the audience. We have Victor asking, with China continue to invest in new coal power plants, how can China achieve carbon neutral in 2060? Justin, I know you've done a little bit of research on, about the China's pledge, and then for different sectors, how would they fare? So this question, can I put it to you? So what's your thoughts in terms of, on the one hand, building more coal-fired power plants? On the other hand, you have to decarbonize. So how does it work?
Sure, I think it's a good question. And I think both Christine touched upon this question in her presentation, and Richard mentioned a bit as well. I will say just sort of I will make one point about timing. I think actually the next 5 to 10 years is actually very important, right? Even though the goal is set at 2060, really the next sort of 10 years, probably, let's say 10 years is really important. And it's really important for two reasons. One is that, and this is to Richard's point earlier, is, we're building renewable energy at a relatively good clip right now. And China has certainly been doing that. But it's still sort of trying to transition from a system of using subsidies to one that's more market-based. And I would say we're sort of only halfway through that at the moment. So whether China can find a solution to build renewable energy at the scale and at the speed that it needs to is a question that will probably need to be resolved in the next 5 years or maybe 10 years at most. So this is very much a near-term situation that we need to, or solution that we need to find. The second point is actually about timing is actually just about the climate itself. If we're aiming, let's say, for the Paris goal, which is 2 degrees or less of warming by 2100, or 1.5 degrees or less, we really have to sort of bend the curve a lot quicker. If we simply wait until 2040, we simply say, okay, let's do business as usual until 2040, and then at that point, let's figure out what we're going to do. It's probably a little bit too late because we would have exhausted the Earth's carbon budget, and there's enough carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to sort of miss our climate goals. So just from that perspective, right, it's very important to do something much more quicker. Now I think just the final point on that question, I think there's sort of two views on this, right? One group might say, well, the coal plants that China are building now are much more efficient. They're going to help potentially Vietnam, Indonesia, India, other countries build more cleaner coal-fired power plants. So why not do that? That's going to sort of bend the curve faster if we retire the more dirtier coal plants and build cleaner ones. But then the other half of this of the coin might say, well, actually we shouldn't do that at all because we need to figure out a way to build renewable energy. We need to scale the solutions now so that we have enough time to hit our goals. So maybe that's not such a good idea. So I think it's, all that is to say, I think China will probably keep building the coal-fired power plants. I don't think that might change. Whether that's not a good idea or not, I think that's obviously debatable, and there's sort of two sides of that debate. But in my view, I think the next 5 to 10 years is very important. So we don't really have a lot of time to sort of, not a lot of buffer in terms of timing on that question.
Okay, appreciate that, Justin. Christine, you want to add?
I think we have been given a clue by the early the early view coming out of Tsinghua. As I said in my presentation, they expect to reduce at an 8 to 10% per annum rate. That gives you a hint that in the 14th and the 15th five-year plan, this is where China has to sort out a lot of stuff. I think it's very easy for us to say, well, it's really important for you to reduce as quickly as you can, ramp up renewables, which they're going to do in any case. And, as I think everyone has said here, on renewables and on nuclear, they're going to go at a clip and at a scale that no one in the world has ever done before. So that's already a given. With the coal is such an important part of China's energy structure at the moment. And they have millions of people whose livelihoods are tied to it. So I think when China makes an announcement by 2060, they've already thought about a lot of this. And no doubt China's going to get criticized by NGOs and many other people to say, you're not serious because you're not doing this in this way. But, when they have to do it themselves, when they have to ramp down coal themselves, they will know how hard it is. So I think at this stage, we also want to watch a number of other industry. Because if you look at steel, maybe I can put it this way. If you look at the major energy guzzler, like steel, like petrochemicals, like cement making, and you track what is already happening in the 13th five-year plan, China is already working on reducing the coal component to it. So I think we're going to have to look at a picture of immense complexity. And you have the decision makers up in Beijing, trying to keep so many balls up in the air. And it's going to offer opportunities. It's going to have times when maybe, there are going to be all kinds of difficulties. But I think for China to have made that pledge, for Korea and for Japan to finally come out and also say that, and to know that they all got to do it. It's very exciting in a way. And I just want to say, this is not a time to start throwing stones yet. Hold your stones for 10 years.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Helen, I saw you nodding. So based on your experience elsewhere, do you agree, what Christine and Justin just mentioned? Hold your stone.
I might hold them for 5 years. I don't know. I think one thing that's really interesting is sort of systemic tipping points within energy systems. And we've seen it elsewhere in terms of how quickly renewables, when sort of 10 years ago, renewable energy, maybe a bit more than 10, but, solar panels weren't very good. And, lots of arguments about wind and so forth. And we've just seen how the renewable energy market has shifted. I mean, partly through things like feed-in tariffs in Germany, which changed the price structures, massive manufacturing in China, complete change to the renewable energy market at a much faster pace and much bigger scale than was ever imagined. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about these things, we're a bit too linear in our, unplug a coal, plug in a nuclear. And as storage technologies improve, as renewables pick up even more, I just think the market, the investment decisions massively change. And I don't talk to people much more versed on how investment decisions are made, but these things are shifting really, really rapidly. And I think the key is to kind of keep things as open as possible for all the different solutions. So yeah, I agree. I assume China's worked this out to some extent, but I think we do need to keep that pressure up to all the countries that are trying to hit these targets. To Justin's point, you know, we talk about the 2020s as the climate decade. The sooner we make decisions, because of the way that carbon sits in the atmosphere, it's just, you've got to get things out as soon as possible. You've got to start investing now and think about the future we want to shape. And there's another question in the chat about, you know, hard to abate, sequestration. These are the things that we're starting to have to think about now, because we want those to play in the 2030s and 40s. It's not a linear journey from here to 2050, 2060, where you sort of plug things in and out. We've got to start really shaping out these pathways and understanding how the investments trigger these systemic changes, which actually just make coal uneconomic, as it is in so many parts of the world now. There's so many parts of the world you wouldn't think about investing in coal. And that's the change that we need to see. And we just need to radically reshape our vision of how these things happen and come about.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Richard?
Thanks, Simon. One thing I think is helpful to try and understand that the scale of what we're doing is to think back to when the electricity industry started in the 1870s. If you've seen the recent movies of Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison, that was all in the 1870s. That was about 150 years ago. What we're doing now is rebuilding all of the infrastructure that we have for supplying electricity. We're replacing all the fossil fuel generation with renewable energy and zero carbon energy production. And we have to do all of that in 30 years, not 150 years. Now, the problem is magnified by the fact that more and more things are becoming electrified. So there's more demand for electricity. So it's an even bigger problem. And then when you think that renewable energy, for the reasons I was explaining earlier, doesn't run all the time. So you need 4 times the capacity of renewable energy to replace the fossil fuel plant. It's an even bigger problem again. So here we have something like 6 to 8 times what we currently have on the planet to supply electricity, all has to be replaced in the next 30 years. And the carbon reduction comes after the replacement has been built. So there's a back ending to this, which means that we've got a transition issue to manage as well. That while we're building all the renewable energy and waiting for it to be built and getting it all working with batteries and new transmission lines and so on, we're still generating electricity with our existing plants. Yeah. And that is all producing carbon dioxide. So a transition strategy is adopting technologies such as gas and such as clean coal. That if you can cut the emissions of your existing coal plants in half by building coal plants, then that is a good way to manage that transition, and it will help see us through a difficult period until we can start to see the fruits of all of this investment that we're going to need. So in my view, we shouldn't be distracting ourselves by saying one technology is better than another. They all play a role. They all play a role in different geographies, in different economic circumstances, and they're part of a very broad toolkit. And we shouldn't be hampering ourselves by saying certain tools we don't like the color of them or the shape of them. They all play a role and they're all important.
Okay, okay.
Simon, yes, thank you. Well, look, I can't remember 1870, but I can remember 1970, when, of course, as a little boy in the UK, one of my things that excited me most is when there was going to be a power cut, and you didn't have to do your homework that evening. You got an excuse from doing your schoolwork. But the point is, of course, that's just illustrating the potential disruption of the beginnings of a transition in the UK away from coal as a fuel. And of course, China faces that on a simply enormous scale, given, as you know, Christine and Richard were saying, how embedded it is in the energy supply system. So I think we do have to be careful. And also, I think when one looks at the very sort of the skeleton of the 14th 5-year plan that's just coming out, there's clearly this reinforcement yet again of how market forces will start to play a bigger role in the Chinese economy. And that will therefore allow everything that Justin and Helen are talking about in terms of the financial viability and increasing financial viability of renewables to play through in the China market. So hold the stones and perhaps ask yourself, when it comes to long dated plans, who's got better track record of preparing plans, implementing plans and delivering on their targets? Is it China or is it somewhere else? So I think we just have to be mindful of that and also think beyond just coal, because coal-fired power is critical, absolutely. We do have to move away from that, but coal-fired power is only about 20% of global CO2 emissions today. And actually the big potent greenhouse gas is not CO2 at all, it's methane. And it's methane going into the atmosphere substantially through other forms of activity, and particularly our food systems and livestock and so forth. And actually, if we want any chance in getting to 1.5 degrees C, then really the only solution is going to be a massive methane reduction, because that will actually drive planetary cooling. So to your point, Christine, this is very complex. I think we do have to, in a sense, yes, don't throw the stones, focus on what we each individually can do and our individual institutions can do, and drive a very complex set of solutions to this huge challenge.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. We're halfway through the panel discussion, and I want to bring our attention back to Hong Kong, because, this is what we really want to discuss today, given China's ambitious commitment. What about Hong Kong? I think, Christine, you mentioned in your remarks, saying it's likely that Hong Kong will have a carbon neutrality plan, maybe for 2050, because usually we'll be a step ahead of what's going on in China. With that, how are we going to make it happen? Now, I have a question actually asking about Hong Kong's journey and how would that relate to GBA, Greater Bay Area's policy action and collaboration with GBA stakeholders. So what's your thoughts?
Well, I think there are many things that Hong Kong doesn't really need to wait to do. And if you look at a city like Hong Kong, we are extremely dense. We have a lot of very tall buildings. They are essentially using electricity, and energy saving in our buildings is doable. And I think we've talked about it over time. Also, we need to improve on how those saving is going to be properly rewarded. That will take, I think, government policy. That will take human changes of our own behavior. That will also require, again, government regulation to really tighten the kind of electrical appliances that are being sold in Hong Kong. So, actually, the more energy efficient we are in the use of our buildings and our infrastructure, the less we will need to think about replacing our current coal plants with gas plants. So I think this is the first thing. No one should have any hesitation about really making a very big play on.
Okay. And Richard and Jonathan, do you want to add to Christine's point? So other than the obvious, we're talking about energy efficiency for buildings and appliances. Of course, we talk about the power sector. What about transportation? What about the other sectors, waste and actually human behavior? I think that's fundamental to, carbon neutrality. How are we going to do it here in Hong Kong? Now, of course, another question, big question, I would like to save it until the end, is about business sector and business action and how business can take the lead. But hold that for a second, I'm very, greedy in terms of questions, but, I know you have a lot to share. Jonathan.
I start, I'll try and be, clearly the physical challenge for Hong Kong is much smaller. In that sense, it's much simpler. There's a lot of it is about energy on the supply side and everything Richard talked about that they're doing. And of course, on the demand side, it's very much a buildings story, and transport and other sectors are are smaller. But I think where Hong Kong has two major roles to play, and Christine touched upon this, is in the area of education. And I think Hong Kong has some extraordinarily strong educational institutions that can play a very important role around sustainability leadership. I think that can only happen, though, if the government does go to the next stage here. And I noticed Christine talked about what the previous government did, and it was sort of a little bit silent as to what the current government has so far done. But I think if Hong Kong can really address domestic issues, that will create a great platform for education. And then the other thing, of course, Hong Kong does in terms of, and looking at the sort of the relative size of impact, of course, comes back to the financial services industry, because our footprint's only 40-something million tonnes. But when we look at our role as a financial hub, and the impact we can have by getting those financing decisions right, what we finance or not what we finance, or what our system supports and what our system doesn't support, that's where we can have huge impact. And that's why I think the huge initiatives here in Hong Kong amongst the public side, the government side, as well as the financial institutions themselves around sort of driving green finance markets and how we do that, and definitions and risk analysis and so forth, and awareness creation is hugely important, because that's what we can as a centre carry into the region with much greater impact.
Okay.
Just a couple of points I'd like to bring out in relation to Hong Kong. One is that Jonathan made a comment earlier when he was talking about the financial sector's emissions, and that it would be easier if the electricity sector was decarbonised for them to meet a carbon reduction target, which is correct. But it will take time for the electricity sector to decarbonise. So transition strategies are also important. Every sector can do things to reduce their electricity demand,
yep,
which will make the problem smaller for the electricity sector, as Christine has rightly pointed out. So one thing we shouldn't do is just pin our hopes on the electricity sector. We need to do everything that we can to help and to do what we can. But at the same time, we also need to recognise that if the electricity sector is able to decarbonise, then that creates opportunities. So shifting to electric vehicles, for example, is something that we can do, and we can do that relatively quickly. And electric vehicles, because they're so efficient, don't actually use much more electricity. So they can help decarbonise a sector because they are an efficient form of transportation. One other point is, if we are looking at decarbonising the electricity sector, there is a limit to what we can actually do in the confines of Hong Kong. And if you look at any city around the world that is developing decarbonisation plans, they don't just think about the city limits of those cities. They think more broadly about what's around them and where can they bring carbon-free electricity in. And Hong Kong should be thinking more broadly than just the confines of Hong Kong. Renewable energy is expensive and it's difficult because of land constraints in Hong Kong. But if we think about the Greater Bay Area, that represents a much bigger opportunity. And that's where I think we should be thinking longer term. Where are the opportunities for us more in our region rather than just in the confines of Hong Kong?
Right. Thank you, Richard. Christine, do you have anything to add in terms of collaborating with Greater Bay Area? Because I know you've been involved in some of these conceptual thinking.
Well, I think you've already sort of got the seeds of what can be done, right? I mean, obviously, any kind of building energy saving technology and management can be shared across the GBA. Secondly, as Richard said, there are opportunities to buy clean power from the GBA. The issue is Hong Kong is already doing it for a long time, so you know exactly how to do it. The issue is the business model and getting the infrastructure strengthened. So, you know, I think policy and business models comes into that. And then how fast we can do that and what is a sensible, I guess, timetable forward. in terms of retiring our fossil fuel plants and what you can buy, but there'll be a lot of competition. I mean, going forward, our neighbors, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Huizhou, they're all going to want the cleaner power. So we mustn't think that just because Guangdong has clean power to provide, that Hong Kong's going to get all of it. Right. So we need to think about how that's going to be. And then, of course, the transportation part. The transportation part is also what China is looking at. I mean, if China is going to continue to take time on the big ticket items, the coal and the industry, then you can already see what China wants to do is by the mid-2035, all vehicles are going to have to be electric or what they call new energy. So if China can ram down its reliance on gasoline and diesel, that will again make a big difference. So same for Hong Kong. Now, but in order for Hong Kong to actually provide the infrastructure needed for electric vehicles, we need the city to be planned with that in mind. Right? As Richard reminded us, we've come from a time where we didn't do that, and now we're going into a time where we have to do that. And then we need the vehicles, and not just the personal vehicles. I think people here are more interested in the public transportation vehicles. So we are back again with double-decker buses and so on, but they are now coming. It is now much more viable. So I think the thing is, how fast is Hong Kong prepared to move on these things? I mean, they're difficult. They're difficult to kind of replan the city or, to find land where you can do all the infrastructure, the charging and all of that.
Okay, sure. It's not going to be easy. And I have Professor Johnny Chan. Actually, he challenged us. Honestly, I don't think Hong Kong will be able to move to carbon neutral in 2060. Let alone 2050, as Christine mentioned. Can the speakers suggest specific ways to make this happen?
Well, actually, I think we've been quite specific. We're hitting, buying power, clean power, buildings. Buildings can be much, much more energy efficient. I mean, people are talking about net zero buildings. Maybe we can clad the external walls of buildings and they become an energy source. We know it's possible with retrofitting buildings over the course of the next 20 years that you can have 40, 50% gain on energy. So this isn't, I think Johnny knows this, it is possible. And I think that the question mark that people have is really on the transportation side.
Okay. Would you say it's also not about the ideas or technology? It's more about how to make it happen, implementation, maybe policy support. That's another.
Well, I said earlier on is for Hong Kong to choose what is a galvanizing focus. Now, China has chosen a number of national galvanizing focus, right? It has been poverty reduction. It is now actually decarbonization and a kind of new China. So I think for Hong Kong, what is our rallying cry? Do we want to ride on that bus or do we have a separate narrative that is actually perhaps not as exciting for either industry or young people and so on?
Okay. Do you have any thoughts, Richard?
Just a comment. I think generally there is a view that electrification is a way that you can, if you can decarbonize electricity, then that provides an opportunity for other sectors to decarbonize. And some of the tougher areas are some of what they call the hard to abate industries. Another tough area is long distance transportation. Now, I think Hong Kong is blessed with the fact that we have very little industry here and we don't have long distances to travel. So we don't have the tough challenges. What we have is an electricity sector. It has its own challenges, but based on current technology that is scaled up, we can solve that problem. We have an opportunity because of the short distances and the high level of public transportation in Hong Kong that we can electrify transportation, again, using current technology. It just needs to be scaled up and well planned and well coordinated, as Christine has said. So many of the tough areas are not our problem. And the challenges that we do have, we have technical solutions for.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Jonathan, you want to add anything?
Well, only perhaps to think about some of the behavioural issues. And of course, Professor Chan is right. I mean, you look at Hong Kong today and you think about the changes necessary and the difficulty it is to change things in Hong Kong, and suddenly it all becomes just impossible and you put your head in your hands. But I think if you, as Richard's doing a little bit and Christine is, if you can look forward to that point in 2050, where we have retrofitted our buildings, where we have put low carbon transport on our streets, and we've reclaimed all that space in our, public spaces for people to sort of live in and enjoy and improve that quality of living. And we've created a sort of a new low carbon industries around education and clean tech, which is a sort of a vibrant part of Hong Kong that's just not really talked about. And in that process, we've sort of created the jobs and the opportunities that, so many of our younger generations of people here in Hong Kong today, they can't see those and they're so frustrated. I think that if you can somehow create that vision, and then you create the sort of, not only the hope that it can be achieved, but the desire to achieve it and the public support to achieve it. And once you've got that public support, I think a lot of the barriers become perhaps a lot lower and lesser of problems than they are today. So I think it is in our hands. It's just because the technology is basically there.
I can certainly confirm that, being attached to a university and talking to, young people in Hong Kong, I think they're looking for the kind of opportunities in this area. And the questions that they ask pertain to, how can I get on that track? And I think it is up to the current generation to show the next generations what these opportunities look like and to point them and say, actually, they're there now. I mean, I've also just, in the last month, have people in the financial services sector say to me that they're looking desperately to hire people with environmental and sustainability skills. And in fact, these are investment banks and fund managers and so on saying, how can we hire people that have sort of like the foundational environmental skills? Because when they come and work for us, we can give them the financial skills. But they recognize that going forward, they actually need people who understand something about the environment.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Questions are still coming in. I'm afraid I can't entertain all the questions, but I will send the questions to the speakers and hopefully we'll get an answer for you. Now, moving into the last 8 minutes, I really want to invite our overseas speakers back to the conversation. Helen and Justin, I'd like to hear from you. What's your expectation for the next year, with COP26 coming up in a year's time? So that's my first question to you both. But more importantly, for Hong Kong, especially for the business sector, I want to hear from you. What's your recommendation to the business sector, what they can do to speed up that process in Hong Kong to decarbonize? Because I think in the last few years, we've seen a lot of commitment from the business sector. Now with these new opportunities, do you think they could do more and how they can do more? Helen, would you like to start first?
Sure, yeah, so the COP, the UN talks will come to Glasgow next year. They should have been happening this week in Glasgow. So there's various things happening this week that, online, but we're hopeful that they'll be in person again next year. The new president of the US, President Biden, when he becomes that, will hold a climate conference, he says, in his first 100 days. That should be the start of a process of getting the US back. But we're still going through the process at the moment of needing new commitments from all the countries. Countries are starting that process and we need to really up that level of ambition. So I think it's going to be a big year for the climate. You started to mention young people there, and we'd expect, particularly as the pandemic plays out, that galvanizing of Fridays for the Future and the movement started by Greta Thunberg, which has been so effective, to be picking up again and pushing hard on COP. And those other moments that were mentioned. In terms of businesses, it's interesting to hear that last discussion, because I thought, I don't know the tone of that question. Was it fear or was it complacency? I could read it both ways, like, well, we won't get there. Or was it, oh, we won't get there? I think there's a good motivation. All of the panelists, I was thinking as I listened to that, we all live on islands. There's a big motivation for all island nations to get this, really take action on climate. Thinking of things like sea level rise and how it's going to affect all of our countries. What can businesses do? Because I think what we were starting to hear, that the scale of the problem and then feeling, you're a small part within that. But one of the things we've seen in the last few years, particularly with the US out of Paris, is just how much business is doing and pushing on and leading to cuts in carbon through making big commitments. I would say businesses, one thing they should do is look at the task force for climate-related financial disclosure, which puts out recommendations for how you assess risk and understand risk, not just in terms of, kind of climate risk as it might seem so very proximate, but what's your risk of stranded assets? How are you invested? What's the longevity of your business? I think if businesses can really start to understand climate in those terms, it can help make good decisions. And then a quick plug for the Climate Group's own work. We run commitment campaigns such as RE100, a commitment to 100% renewable electricity, EV100, commitment on electric vehicles, and EP100, committing to energy efficiency. With all of those, what we see with businesses, if you pick one, you set a commitment, it seems, very ambitious. We're seeing businesses hit those commitments early. And then what we can do as a campaign is use that collective demand signal to talk to markets, to talk to countries, say, look, all these businesses here are committed. RE100 has been mentioned in the Japan, the recent policies about green recovery, and similarly in South Korea. So governments are recognizing those corporate campaigns, listening to the voice of business, and that interaction between markets and policy through those sorts of campaigns is really important.
Thank you, Helen. Justin?
Sure, I'll keep my remarks brief. I think sort of two things in terms of the looking to ahead question that you mentioned, Simon. With China, I think we all sort of agree it's the 14 5-year plan and how that would play out. As mentioned, a net zero target really brings in the whole economy. And there's hope that sort of one of the centerpieces of the 14 5-year plan is how China hopes to build a more energy efficient or less emissions intensive economy, and also to sort of solve some of the issues that we discussed in the power system and with renewable energy subsidies, etc. I think internationally, ahead of COP26 probably is what other countries in Asia will do. The big elephant in the room is India. I'm not sure that I would say India will announce a net zero target by COP26, but certainly, from our conversations with government in India, they're watching very closely what China's announcement means, and then certainly Japan and Korea's recent announcements has just added pressure to probably India, the Indian government, to say something. So I think that's going to be something that we want to watch very closely. India is about 9% of the world's emissions. It's basically the next largest one after the US. So that's going to be one to watch closely. I'll make one final point about Hong Kong. I used to live in Hong Kong for 8 years, so sometimes I still feel like I should be in the room rather than outside looking in. I do think that there's sort of two things about that. One is the opportunity for international business, and by that I do include also mainland Chinese business in Hong Kong. I think that over the last 10 years, we've seen that many clean energy companies in mainland China has raised a lot of money through Hong Kong. I think Jonathan probably spoke to that and knows that really well. And that would probably likely continue in the future, right? As sort of Hong Kong as a center of finance, we see that Chinese companies increasingly involved in these business activities will continue to use Hong Kong as a conduit. And the second point, I just want to agree also with what Richard and Christine were saying is I think, in terms of a net zero target for Hong Kong, probably it's easier than mainland China in the sense that, we're mostly talking about power and transport and buildings. So it'd be great to see whether there are local solutions that businesses or entrepreneurs in Hong Kong can develop with regards to building energy efficiency or electric vehicle charging. I think that's, in my sort of 8 years that I lived in Hong Kong, I probably didn't see that enough interest locally as probably there is in, other major cities across Asia. So if anything, I think the net zero target in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong government does move towards that. My hope is that galvanizes some of that sort of activity. And that would be really something I think would be great to see.
Okay, thank you, Justin. I think we are almost done now. I want to ask Christine, Richard, and Jonathan, any last thoughts you want to share before I close?
Well, I just want to repeat what the Secretary for the Environment has said. He has already publicly pledged that there will be a plan on EV popularization. So I think hopefully some of the things that Justin and others have talked about that we'll know more quite soon, because I think he's thinking of putting that plan out next year.
Yep.
Then there will be a 2050 climate plan where I think EVs and all these other issues will hopefully be discussed.
Right.
And then there is a tech plan that hopefully will allow Hong Kong to make funds available for the kind of things that maybe Hong Kong-based companies would want to look for. So I think the conditions are there. It's just a matter of grabbing the bull by the horn, getting government to align itself and to align itself with society and with the corporates, because nobody can get to net zero on their own.
Thank you.
I'd just like to expand on a point that Justin brought out around the opportunities that Helen has mentioned, that climate change is a risk and businesses need to understand that risk. But Justin's also touched on an important point, that it's also an opportunity. And I see one very clearly for the electricity sector. There is a huge amount of work and a huge amount of opportunity, but Hong Kong is no different to any other society in the world. We're all facing the same challenge. There's different things that have to be done in different sectors, but all of this represents opportunities for businesses.
Right, okay. Jonathan?
I think just building on what Richard has said there, this sort of recognition that if we get it wrong, there's going to be a huge price to pay. But if we get it right, there's a much better future in prospect for all of us, I think.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you all again. Thank you, Christine, Richard, Jonathan, and Helen from London, Justin from Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is a very enjoyable conversation and a very important one as well. So thank you all for tuning in and staying until the very end. And I hope you enjoy the conversation as well. So with that, have a nice evening, have a nice day. Goodbye. Hope to see you in the next BEC event. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.